We'll start off with some breaking news. During the IPL argument in court today, the Supreme Court has observed and told Kapil Sibal, who is appearing for N.Srinivasan, that as per them, the best option is the reconstitution of the BCCI minus Srinivasan, which will look into the matter. Now, the court has also asked as to what are the options and the suggestions. Remember, there is no let-up for the BCCI and Supreme Court even earlier, because any penalty disenfranchising teams from the IPL should be carried out by the BCCI, is what the Supreme Court has observed yesterday, while at the same time raising questions about the composition of the board that should be empowered to take such a decision. Radhika and Rasesh are joining us in the story. Radhika and Boria Majumdar as well. Radhika, no let-up again for the BCCI. Now, the Supreme Court coming down hard, saying that there should be a reconstitution of the body minus N.Srinivasan.
Yes, Sanjana, exactly. That is what the Supreme Court has just said. What they have said, that the BCCI elections that are slated for December 17th should take place minus Srinivasan. They feel that since the people involved in this probe, Mayappan happens to be his son-in-law, there is a lot of conflict of interest, and that is why the best course of action, so that a fair trial can happen, a fair probe into the IPL spot fixing matter can happen, they should hold these elections minus Srinivasan. The court has also asked Kapil Sibal, if this is not what they feel is right, they should come up with alternate options. Sibal was presenting a couple of options. He said that they should probably set up a two-member probe panel or get people from the governing council of IPL to look into the matter, but the court rejected it, saying they wanted a proper proposal from Kapil Sibal, proper ideas of what else can be done, because they feel anything that is constituted under the current administration of the BCCI cannot be fair, since there is a lot of vested interest, since Gurunath Mayappan happens to be N.Srinivasan's son-in-law. That is why they feel that these elections should take place minus Srinivasan.
Let me quickly go across to Boria. Boria, it seems like the Supreme Court is in no mood to have any kind of negotiation that will sort of involve Kapil Sibal's options, because so far, whatever he seems to be suggesting obviously has the role of N.Srinivasan in some way or the other, which is going to influence the workings of the BCCI. The Supreme Court is in no mood. Even yesterday, they raised several questions about the constitution of the BCCI. Today, in fact, coming down very hard, saying that the body must be reconstituted minus N.Srinivasan.
This is the first time, Sanjana, for the first time the Supreme Court is giving this option, that the BCCI, there are 2 points here which are of significance for the viewers and for the reconstitution of Indian cricket. One, the elections should take place, so that option, if you read between the lines, the option that the BCCI has been exercising for the longest time over the last 2-3 months is every time something happens, they defer the AGM, 26th of September to 20th of November, then from 20th of November to the 17th of December. So clearly the Supreme Court is telling them no more doing that, no more deferring the AGM for one particular individual. Second, reconstitute the board, because we will not allow Mr. Srinivasan to be reinstated, and under his presidency we don't have faith that this probe can be carried out impartially. So clearly a message going out to the BCCI that come up with credible options, because otherwise we will be forced to pass a direction. It is going in that direction. For the first time, the Supreme Court is telling the board, keep Srinivasan out. Now what the board does to that, can Kapil Sibal. Now interestingly, Kapil Sibal is not the counsel for the BCCI.
Right.
Kapil Sibal is the counsel for N.Srinivasan. Can Kapil Sibal come up with options? What will the BCCI say? Can the BCCI now turn back and say, no, we will protect Mr. Srinivasan despite the Supreme Court saying it? These are some very, very important questions which will be deliberated upon during the rest of the day.
But Boria, what is the sense you're getting when it comes to the BCCI standpoint so far? Do you think they're going to actually come out? Because as you've pointed out, this is Kapil Sibal is N.Srinivasan's lawyer. He's not the counsel for the BCCI. So here it's going to be again within vested interest, another round of, sort of protecting Srinivasan's interests once again. So do you think the BCCI is going to come out in support of Srinivasan, or then they're going to look out for themselves here?
If they come out in support of Srinivasan, the way I see this case going, they will have no option, because then the Supreme Court will pass an order. Even if it's an interim order, it will be an order, because clearly from what I understand from the hearing there, if 17th is sacrosanct, 17th the AGM has to go on. That is what the Supreme Court is clearly telling the BCCI, that you cannot do it anymore. So now if the BCCI doesn't come out with an option, I think the Supreme Court will force their hand. And look at it, the BCCI will come across in a very poor light in front of the country when the apex judiciary of the land is basically telling you, come up with an option, keep this man out, go ahead with the election, clean Indian cricket, and you're not wanting to abide by what the apex judiciary of the land says. You come across in a very, very poor light. So obviously the head honchos, the political head honchos of the BCCI will now have to take a stand. They've been constantly keeping quiet. They've been absolutely stone silent from the board for the last 1 month. But now the Supreme Court has thrown the ball to them and says, come up with options. You cannot keep quiet and keep throwing the ball at the Supreme Court. I don't think the BCCI has much room for maneuver, Sanjana. I genuinely don't. So I think time is fast running out for Mr. Srinivasan.
Buria, stay with us. Let me quickly go across to Rasesh. Rasesh, if you could for our viewers just sort of highlight, because we remember there were 3 issues highlighted during the hearings yesterday around N.Srinivasan's alleged conflict of interest, which has been brought into focus by the 2-man bench and the BCCI's own official position on the issue and the action to be taken in the IPL case.
Yes, I think what are the options available now for the BCCI for following the observation that the Supreme Court's come up with? Boria has touched most of the points. I think the only thing that BCCI may still want to consider is to argue for Srinivasan stepping aside pending inquiry and then trying to maneuver the numbers within the BCCI. Can that happen in this scenario where the Supreme Court has asked all those difficult questions of Srinivasan, all along raised this issue of conflict of interest, specifically questioned the possibility of bias in a situation where Srinivasan happens to own the franchise as well and be the board president, when the Supreme Court is wanting to take direct actions against Mayappan, when the Supreme Court specifically says that BCCI with Srinivasan may not be in a position to act upon it. I think it's then that the BCCI members and their next course of action becomes important. Boria has mentioned about the fact that it's been a month now since the time that Model Committee report's been submitted, and there has been zero activity on the BCCI front. All that we've got to say is that the matter is sub judice, and silently one understands that the boards would be fairly comfortable if the Supreme Court were to allow Srinivasan to recontest. Now in this situation where there has been so much of BCCI's reputation at stake, would the BCCI members take a different stance? I think that is something that remains to be seen. The only legal argument the board may have is to argue that Srinivasan step aside. Will that be allowed by the Supreme Court? The goings on of their observation so far suggests that that may not be the case.
Rajesh, stay with us. Let me quickly go across to Boria. Boria, let's now talk about the Chennai Super Kings, because the Supreme Court yesterday had also questioned, saying, why can't the Chennai Super Kings be disqualified? So what happens now about the cricketing? We've talked about the BCCI, we've talked about Srinivasan. Let's talk about the actual players that are involved in the case now.
With your permission, Sanjana, I'll just want to make one point before I answer this question. The point that Rasesh was mentioning about Srinivasan stepping aside. I don't think that's going to happen. 2 reasons. One, this is an election. Srinivasan stepping aside means he contests. Only then can he step aside. The election for the BCCI president will have to take place on the 17th of December, and that is sacrosanct according to the Supreme Court, or that is the indication that we are getting. So will the Supreme Court agree that Srinivasan contests, wins, then steps aside? But if he wins, do you think the Supreme Court will agree that there will be no influence by this man on the rest of the board? Because clearly if he contests or is reinstated, even if it's for a time being, he will wield influence. So this step aside formula, which was possible last year because it was an elected president, that is not going to come into play. And the elected president, whoever it is, if it's anybody barring Srinivasan, will be elected for 3 years, 2 years plus 1. So there is no formula which can bring Srinivasan back again, because what happens then, even if Srinivasan is cleared, there will have to be a fresh election, 3/4 majority, the current elected president will have to be removed. Now that will result in a constitutional crisis. I don't see that happening. I see either or. I see either Mr. Srinivasan is reinstated, allowed to contest, or Mr. Srinivasan is gone and the BCCI goes ahead without him. I don't see a step-aside formula where he contests, elected, steps aside. That's going to happen. Coming to your Chennai Super Kings answer,
right.
I think the Supreme Court is clearly giving the BCCI the opportunity to take action and get its house back in order. But the opportunity comes with a caveat. The caveat is do it without Srinivasan. Because they feel that the board has to be blemish-free, they feel the board has to be with credibility, they feel to restore fans' faith, you cannot keep this man in a position of power and then go ahead. So the way I feel is Chennai Super Kings will be left to the BCCI to take action against, but a BCCI that will not have Mr. N. Srinivasan at its helm of affairs.
Boria, stay with us. Let me quickly go across to Radhika. Radhika, we understand that there's an update coming in from the Supreme Court because now they're saying that the Supreme Court is saying that action has to follow immediately, and don't say that there is a criminal case going on somewhere in some court in Mumbai because it may go on for 20 years. This is what they've said now, the latest observation.
Yes, Anjana, like it's been mentioned, the Supreme Court is very fixed on the point that the BCCI elections should happen. And like Boria mentioned, they have already been postponed many times. And that is why the Supreme Court, when they asked today Kapil Sibal to present options, they were very specific that do present us options. We will see if any of them are viable or not, or else we will give you the option. They have already said that as far as they are concerned, the best course of action is holding the elections minus Srinivasan. And that is why when Kapil Sibal is quoting other cases where he said that as far as other criminal proceedings are going on, the Supreme Court is fixated on this case. They have said talk about this particular case, talk about the options that are available to the BCCI as far as the elections on 17th are concerned. If any of those options seem feasible to us, we will consider it. Otherwise, this is the best formula that we are providing you. So it seems like Kapil Sibal is trying to come up with other options, trying to come up with arguments that can probably help Srinivasan's case, but whether the Supreme Court will heed to them, it seems highly unlikely at the moment, Sanjana.
Right, we understand though, Radhika, that the BCCI said that they will come up with options at 2 p.m. this afternoon.
Yes, Sanjana. The thing, once the Supreme Court asked Kapil Sibal to give up options, he had given a couple to the Supreme Court. He said, like I mentioned earlier as well, he said that we can probably constitute a 2-member committee which will look into the probe, get people from the governing council. But when the Supreme Court said that we do not want options at the top of your hat, we want you to think them through. We want you to come up with proper options, which, by the way, they said very clearly that all the options that you are currently discussing in front of us have already been exercised by the BCCI, and they still have administrators which have influence. They still have administrators who have vested interest, considering Gurunath Mayappan is the son-in-law of N.Srinivasan, and that is why Kapil Sibal will come up with options, probably consulting N.Srinivasan and coming up with options. See if any of them suit the requirements that the Supreme Court has put up in front of N.Srinivasan and his counsel.
Right, and let me quickly go back to Boria. Boria, we've spoken about Chennai Super Kings, and I discussed this with Rasesh earlier as well. Towards the end of the hearing, a writ petition was also admitted by the Supreme Court that was questioning Shivlal Yadav's role now.
And now that becomes the most important question. You actually hit the nail on the head. That was my point. Mr. Sibal is not supposed to come up with options. Now the board is supposed to come up with options. It will be C.A. Sundaram who has to come up with options based on directives from the interim president, i.e. Shivlal Yadav, from the secretary, i.e. Sanjay Patel, from the rest of the BCCI members who so far decided to keep mum. Question is, how can Mr. Srinivasan come up with options? He's president in exile at this point in time. This is now about the welfare and the future of the Board of Control for Cricket in India. As to how the Board of Control for Cricket in India decides to restore credibility, decides to bring back fans' faith, decides to make it blemish-free, decides to conduct a free and fair election. Now, the Supreme Court's directive is on the wall. Keep this man out, go ahead. Now, how can Mr. Sibal come up with an option that, this is an option that has to be exercised by the Board of Control for Cricket in India. And there, Shivlal Yadav's role is pertinent and supremely important as the interim president. He cannot shy away and say this matter is sub judice. He cannot run away from the cameras and say, oh, I don't want to talk about it. That has been the stand of these board members. Shivlal Yadav, Rajiv Shukla, all of these head honchos of the board keep saying it. Oh, the matter is sub judice. We will not say a thing. Let the Supreme Court tell you. Now the Supreme Court is telling them, come up with options. Mr. Sibal will obviously come up with options. Maybe one will be that, I will stay away from all IPL affairs and let there be an interim president for the IPL like Sunil Gavaskar. But again, that option has already been exercised by the BCCI and that option has failed. So it is very difficult. If you actually think through, Sanjana, think through options, the BCCI has very little room left for maneuver as to how it can get Mr. Srinivasan reinstated at this point in time.
Absolutely, Boria Majumdar, thank you so much for bringing us those developments, and Radhika for joining us from outside the Supreme Court, and Rasesh. We'll continue tracking the story as the hearing, remember, has resumed in Supreme Court. The apex court coming down hard on the BCCI and N.Srinivasan, making some crucial observations in court today. The Supreme Court has told Kapil Sibal, who is appearing for N.Srinivasan, that as per them, the best option is the reconstitution of the BCCI minus N.Srinivasan. Remember, this is the first time that the Supreme Court has offered this option in the entire hearing of the IPL case. We have Rasesh Mandani now joining us with more. Rasesh, the court coming down hard on the BCCI, coming down hard on Kapil Sibal, talking tough. They're really obviously not willing to let up on this easily, because even yesterday they raised several questions, and today they want the BCCI to submit their options before the court by 2 p.m. this afternoon.
Yes, that's right. The BCCI would write to the Supreme Court with the options available. In fact, Kapil Sibal has been asked to come up with options, and some of the options that has been come up with, as you mentioned, one of them is I think primarily what the court is looking at is not just about the makeup of the BCCI in the future, also about melting out punishment. The inferences that have been come up by Justice Mudgal. Justice Mudgal committee has carried out extensive investigation in the spot fixing scandal and the issues around it, and how would they be implemented. The court has given a sense that it is unsure that the BCCI would be in a position to act with Srinivasan at the helm of the affairs. Hence, it's directly come up with the board and told them that there should be a reconstitution of the BCCI minus N.Srinivasan. And this is for the first time that in so direct terms the court has observed this. It's asked Kapil Sibal to come up with the options, and also the court is then looking at one of the points that was raised in one of the hearings earlier by the BCCI was an outside agency and an outside committee being formed, which can then implement some of the findings of Justice Mudgal committee. But it's not just about that. What are the options that the BCCI can come up with in a scenario where the AGM has to take place in a week's time, and the court has observed that they would be more comfortable if there is a BCCI minus N.Srinivasan. Clearly, the options for the BCCI are limited. They are cornered in this situation, and the Supreme Court is coming down hard on not just the issues of conflicts of interest, but also as far as the implementations of the findings of Justice Mudgal committee is concerned.
Absolutely, Rasesh. Thank you so much for bringing us those developments. We'll continue tracking the story as the hearing, remember, has resumed in this case. The Supreme Court coming down hard on the BCCI. Obviously, no let up for the body or N.Srinivasan so far.